Hey everybody, welcome back to Terminus, the very hungry caterpillar of extreme metal podcasts. I am the death metal guy, aka Black Sabbath themed 1970s Key Party.
And I am the black metal guy, aka Electric Wizard finally catching on in Kazakhstan.
I've kind of run out of podcasts, so now I'm just going to start doing books, movies,
For sure. No, I've had a few good ideas for that. We'll keep them in the bag.
We'll leave them in. We got a weird episode for the kids today, but let's do our housekeeping.
Yeah. So, first off, last week's episode has done pretty damn well, and that owes in large part to defeated sanity for actually taking the time to listen and sharing our stuff, which is from
very
a
cool.
Legendary band like that.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. And also to Brandon Corsair from Dragcar and Azath, who
not Brandon Lee, but yeah.
Yeah, not Brandon Lee from The Crow, who did us a solid and shared our stuff, and we has been sort of consistently supportive of this show when we've covered his bands. So thanks to Brandon. And also Brandon sent me a couple things. I honestly still haven't had time to look at them as much as I want to, but they're he wrote these articles for Toilet of with a V Hell about his sort of exploring the histories of the micro niches in early death metal that influenced him.
Yeah.
So if you liked that part of the show last time, if you like Dragcar, if you're interested in that, he's got 3 articles, and they are Forlorn Skies, an introduction to melodic death metal, an introduction to Hellenic death metal, and an introduction to Finnish death metal. And, everyone kind of knows Finn death, and melodic death metal, but he really focuses on specific aspects of these scenes that have been missed. And Hellenic death metal is something that I'm not even sure I knew was much of a thing until the last few months. And
it's kind of before all those bands became black metal. They were playing death metal in the very early 90s.
Yeah, I listened all the way through finally to the first Septic Flesh after hearing that this was a big influence on him. I'm like, God, that album's brilliant. Mm-hmm. It's, maybe a little too much guitar wank at times, but it's really good. I
read the Finnish death metal article, and it's very good, and clearly Brandon has an appreciation for these, niche old school death metal scenes. Yeah. Well beyond mine, I'll fully admit. His understanding and, just the breadth of his listening far exceeds mine.
Given that his taste in it is kind of necro and melodic and whatever, and black metal amenable, I'll probably use it as a guide for doing this sort of classic death metal archaeology that I haven't done.
The kind of stuff that he's into would definitely be
it's
more
really
up your
good,
alley.
and once you understand...
You had a break.
Yeah,
I'll
exactly.
fix it.
And the scholarly nature of it, not in a pejorative way. What? Okay. The scholarly nature of it is not in a pejorative way. Helps explain how original Dragcar sounds, right? Even though they're drawing on all this old school material, but he's gone back to the origin, and he's looking at all these forgotten things that are kind of like undeveloped potentials within it.
Yeah, right? These sort of evolutionary dead ends that didn't need to be dead ends.
Exactly, and it means that rather than just trying to, add one more gimmick to whatever's popular today, right? He's doing something that's pretty original because it's tapped into the origin.
Yeah.
Okay, So yeah, that's our little Dragcar plug, and that's our last episode if you haven't heard it. So for this episode, I suppose, I think we're gonna have a weird structure. We've got a big audience of people, I think, who come to our show for sort of raw and or underground USBM stuff, right? American underground, and that's clearly an area where we've done well, and as an American underground dudes. That's something we're going to make sure to always emphasize on this show.
Yeah.
If you want your cool, ripping, sort of melodic USBM, go to the end of the show and listen to our segment on Mortum from New Jersey, which is going to be really in-depth because it's a touchstone for a lot of things we love. If that's what you want to start with. But we usually start with a record that we both like. And this time, the other record that we're both really into, because we're really into the Mortum as well, is Coproporeal by Induced.
Yes.
So, why don't you give us and if you're a black metal guy, that might immediately, or classic death metal guy, just those phrases might immediately running for the proverbial hills, or running to them. But hang on, because there's probably stuff here that will appeal to you, especially if you like really minimal savage black metal.
Yeah, definitely. So
yeah, take us through let's go through the rundown of bands and labels, and then we'll hit it.
So, as my buddy said, we're opening with the first record by Induced, Coproporeal. This is an international project, apparently split between Spain and Russia, but we're not sure who the personnel are. And this is released on New Standard Elite.
It had to be the Russians.
Yeah, this is released on New Standard Elite, which we haven't covered anything from before, but we will likely be revisiting a lot. They're a very important label in brutal death metal and have been for about the past 5 years, and they really specialize in that sort of ultra brutal, almost art music style of brutal death that we've touched on like a couple times on this show.
Their stuff is also all name your price on Bandcamp. So even if you're not a Bandcamp person, it might be worth making an account, or
just to get high quality files. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So cool label in that sense too. Yeah. And then our next one, we're going to do, another New Jersey band, Siege Column. This is, from a family of bands featuring people like Joe Aversario and Tom G. Warrior, who they started out in a band called Dethroned Emperor years ago. They've had tons of projects. Their probably most famous one is Death Fortress, which is like the #1 hate forest worship band. A number of other cool small projects with different people. This is Joe and another guy. This is Siege Column's Darkside Legions, and it's out now on Nuclear War Now. It's coming out in 2 weeks. It's coming out around the 15th, I think, 14th or 15th. So we will get into that. That's just sort of raw, as you can kind of tell from the title and the label, raw, ripping, old school 80s filth.
Yeah.
Right? That's the genre, 80s filth. So, and then you've got a pick after that.
I've got the new record by Disavowed called Revocation of the Fallen. Disavowed, a longtime kind of second-tier classic band in the brutal death metal scene, with their first new album in about 13 years. Their last one was in 2007. This is released on Brutal Mind, an Indonesian brutal death and grind label who have been around for a long time, but mostly stuck to the regional scene. But lately, they've been picking up on a lot of older brutal death artists making their return, and have kind of catapulted themselves to the forefront of the brutal death metal scene. So we'll probably be revisiting that label in the future. And let's tie it up with your big pick, where Autism Hour will flourish.
Yeah, I think we're not going to do a separate Autism Hour add-on. It's just going to be the Mortum review.
Oh, yeah.
There's a lot of places to branch off in there. So, Mortum, from New Jersey, like I said, they've been around for a while, but always under the radar. This is Atlantean Ouroboros. And it is independently released, but I think also there's going to be a tape coming out on a really good tape label called Folkvangr Records, which is someplace out west. And there might be one other label handling some physical release, but I can't remember it right now. But Folkvangr is great, and if you're into sort of it's an interesting range of generally kind of heatheny, pagany, black metal and folk stuff, and dungeon synth, often well curated. Dungeon synth that doesn't suck.
A vanishingly rare commodity.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, so that'll be the end of the show, and let's get going.
All right, let's get started with the first release period by Induced, called Coproporeal. And I think you've got kind of a thesis you wanted to talk about this style of music that we've started to come back to repeatedly, mostly coming from my end.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to address, it's silly to say, we got to play up the black metal guy, death metal guy, because obviously our taste overlaps a ton, and obviously we wouldn't be doing this show.
Well, that being said, to clarify to people, I mean, we've been talking about music for a long time, and you've always known me to like a lot of brutal death metal, but as we've been exploring some of these records I bring onto the show, it feels like your appreciation for it on this pretty, high-minded level, I hate using that phrase, but getting in touch with the fact that this is music with meaning, and this is music with real content, for lack of a better
artistic
word.
Worth. Yeah, sure. Yeah, and which is something you've always argued, and I've been receptive to, but, now I'm starting to get it more, and I just wanted to say to, I guess, quote-unquote, my part of the listener base, and I'm trying to say it's not just mine. Yeah. Right? To the sort of raw black metal people, to the people from the punk scene or whatever, right? We're gonna keep having stuff like this on the show, and I think there's a case to be made for it, right? I think we're, sort of splitting the show between the most extreme and authentic ranges of black metal and the most extreme and sort of And new. We try to focus on new stuff, bands doing interesting things. There are other bands releasing great albums and other bands that are more in the mainstream, getting more coverage.
Yeah.
Good, interesting new shit in the underground. Similarly, one of the most vital places in death metal right now is stuff like brutal death, slam, tech death, right? All of this stuff. And I think, from an outsider's perspective, it can be hard to get your hooks in, and you can listen to 15 seconds of it and be like, well, this is pointless and sterile garbage. Some of it is, and I'm going to complain about that a little bit less later on in the show. But the thing is, it's really extreme and bizarre music. And if you want to keep track of the leading edge of what's going on today, well, it's not caverncore bands, right?
Yeah, that's basically dead now.
It is kind of dead now, and to some extent, right, that's barely even death metal. It's death metal bands doing things black metal bands do less well.
Yeah.
Same with the sort of scrunky kind of heavily corded DSO influence stuff, right? Unless you're ulcerate, right? That shit is stale and also sort of under black metal hegemony.
Yeah.
Right? Other leading edge death metal is basically black metal. And
versus stuff like this where it's entirely constrained to its own conceit and is just driving, just barreling down this fucking road into...
Yeah, and like we talked about on the last episode, there's maybe an area of promise outside this region is the sort of original old school stuff done by Sepulchral Curse and Dragcar, right?
Yeah.
And I hope to see that develop a lot more, because that's, more where I'm coming from, more my cup of tea in death metal. But this sort of, this brutal stuff, it's worth paying attention to. And I think, let's use a word to gather it all together. So I came up with the word mecha-death, right? This is to oppose these sort of new bands that deliberately use this sort of computerized production, deliberately use triggers sometimes, deliberately use kind of this sterile, highly technical sound.
Yeah.
As opposed to, let's say, bio-death, right? The old sort of gory, visceral body music.
Yeah,
sort of cryptic and murky kind of stuff. And so, yeah, mecha-death, I think, is something we're going to keep having on this show a lot because it's interesting to talk about, and I've certainly developed, just by following the bands the death metal guy has brought in, I've started to pick up on differences within it and things I like better and don't like as much. And,
yeah, I mean, just the idea that there is nuance to it is probably very unusual to a lot of people who didn't grow up with it. Yeah.
You know what it is? Most of this stuff, although I think with an exception, this Induced, which I really like, and the Defeated Sanity last week, which I'm going to buy. It's fantastic. A lot of this stuff I'm not going to listen to again, but it's like, some weird modern art shit or conceptual stuff where even if it's not immediately your cup of tea, I don't know, like the colors in a Kandinsky painting are pretty fucking lame to me, right? I'm like, why are these bright, fruity colors, But once you look at 3 or 4 or 5 of them, you start to notice patterns and notice interesting things going on.
Yeah.
Right?
Well,
and that's kind of a one way to appreciate this stuff. Anyway.
Well, let's just jump right into a sample. We talked around it enough, so let's just give people an idea of what this kind of music sounds like.
All right.
So, and then I'll get into a little bit about the heritage that it's coming from and what makes this band different. So, let's listen to my first sample off a track called Derivated Serotonergic Neurosis.
All right.
Alrighty. All right, so that's pretty awful sounding.
Yes.
So, kind of like I was saying at the top, Induced is a new entry into this field of what I like to call ultra brutal death metal, or other people call it blasting brutal death metal. But in essence, a lot of it is descended from a lineage started by Brodequin back in the late 90s or early 2000s. With more or less slam influence. There's a lot of slam on this record, but it doesn't feel like a slam album. You know what I mean?
And for those who don't know Brodequin, that's a cool band. It's medieval torture themed death metal, and if you like war metal stuff, you'll like Brodequin. It's formally brutal death metal, but it really does. It has a more organic sound than a lot of the mecha-death bands. Mm-hmm. And if you like brutal blasting shit, you'll enjoy it.
I mean, if you like revenge, there's no reason you shouldn't listen to Brodequin.
Exactly.
So, what's interesting to me, so this band is clearly from this lineage, from Brodequin, and then more recently, Enmity, which is, a band that was so hated for so many years, but is also so formative to this entire branch of death metal. It always bears repeating. So what's interesting, though, is kind of the nuts and bolts of how this music works. So one thing that I want to draw attention to, and this is a theme that comes up over and over again on this record, is what I call the inverted slam. So a regular slam riff or slam passage rather, is based around sort of a vital hook on a guitar riff, just like slow and palm muted, and all your attention is given to that riff. But here, the slam riff tends to be very meaningless and looping. They go on for a long time, just playing sort of a rhythmic loop while the drums slice across the rhythmic space. And they create these sharp angles because you're not sure where the snare's going to hit or where the main pulse of the music is. And they tend to go on too long with the drums sort of shifting underneath texturally, so you'll lose context for where these segments kind of begin and end, which is a really interesting and novel idea I haven't really heard before.
Yeah, I think it's, we talked last time with the Embryectomy, which is just like the most slammy slam record ever.
Yeah.
about how that that uses the slam almost kind of like the slam itself, the guitar, as a percussion instrument, right? As a bludgeon, right? And also on that show, we talked about how Defeated Sanity is centered around percussion, but in a different way, in that obviously, the writing all happens around their just insane virtuoso drummer, right? Yeah. This band is doing more like the Defeated Sanity thing, right? Yeah. It's actually written around the drums, but instead of using the drums to play these sort of jazz, free jazz fusion-esque, sort of flowing, organic, melodic and rhythmic ideas, you're basically using the drums like a sort of to do the equivalent of war metal trem riffing, right? Or something like that. It's brutal riffing played on drums.
Yeah, and you're sort of, the drums in a lot of sense, they kind of contort the music and the song structures here, because there's a lot of passages where
I see what you mean.
The guitars are just like a stabilizing force on the edges of the music while the drums are doing their thing. Yeah.
This makes sense. Yeah, it's like, let's play my sample.
Okay, sure.
And we'll hear more of that. So this is from Compulsatory Mesolimbolic Delusion.
All right.
All right. You can't know. There's no getting out of this delusion because it's compulsatory.
All right. Let's give that a try.
To me, I guess what's really interesting to me about this sample is that first riff, or the one that starts a few seconds into it. Before that, I couldn't really get my hooks in this. I was listening to it late at night, low volume, and just being like, well, I don't know, this is some brutal death metal, I guess. But here's where they sort of lock into a groove there, right? Mm-hmm. And you can really hear what you were just saying about the guitar, the drums kind of... A thing I'll come back to in this show is almost like, what's playing the role of a medium and what's shaping it? Or where's the energy moving through that sonic substance or stuff coming from? And here, maybe it's really like, where Defeated Sanity has the guitars are written around the drums, but there's amazing riffing always happening, right? This is like, the guitars are a kind of passive medium that are getting shaped by the drums. That's kind of like what you're getting at.
No, exactly. I think this is first and foremost a drum-based record. That is the primary instrument to listen to.
Which doesn't mean the guitar writing is thoughtless or bad. Not at all. So here you get this sick sort of slowed down it's like the motion in the riffs is kind of mid-tempo-y, but there's hyper blasting, and you get this sort of looping, pulsed feel that's really different from any rhythmic idea you'd get in traditional black or death metal that's this minimal.
I mean, I would almost argue that I feel there is an almost black metal quality to that section just because what you're listening for, it's going very fast, but the real internal pulse of the music is around like the half note, rather than a quarter note. It's got that...
it's the suspense.
Yeah, that suspended quality. Yes.
As in like the way something can blast so fast that if you're playing big block chords over blast beats, like say you're Druid or something, right? The music, or at times in Hate Forest or whatever, right? The music slows down.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So definitely has that quality, and but the ceaseless percussive battering on the drums gives it a lot more sort of immediate aggressive oomph than like, one of those flowing, rolling black metal slow riffs.
Yeah, it wants you to feel that pure, like, visceral energy with every stroke.
Yeah, it's a great snare sound. One reason I like this genre, I think, is that I love trash can snares. The St. Anger snare. And, then it goes into this kind of OSDM riff, right? And we talked about, traditional single string trem thing, right? Not interesting in itself, right?
Yeah.
But it's important. It's important punctuation, and it does this trade-off with the chug after it. Mm-hmm. And I feel like a strategy, what I'm getting the sense of is a lot of bands in the brutal death or slam are using sort of like section trading as an idea.
Yeah.
Like, the whole riff idea is two ideas that bounce off each other. And maybe that's also a thing that's happening more in death metal right now as a way of generating new ideas.
Well, yeah, because I think...
And more dynamism in the music.
Well, because a point that you've made that you haven't said it, like, out front, which is... Mm-hmm. That really, it's just, this whole project as a record is an inversion of death metal standards, where the guitars are the leading instrument, it's riff-based, and the drums provide, a punctuating backdrop. It's entirely inverted. At this point, the riffs are there to sustain the energy of the music and to do what is expected of them, and then the drums are what drive off and play a lead role. And the same goes...
It gives some body to the music.
Yeah, and it gives body to the music.
And the guitar, yeah.
The same idea can be said for the vocals.
We like, the chugs are there, right?
Yeah, the chugs are there.
The vocals.
So the vocals in this band, in a lot of brutal death metal band, they are a punctuating rhythmic quality, but here they're just a slurry of pitch-shifted gurgles. They're merely there they are providing a bed of texture and momentum in the same way a blast beat does in a black metal band.
Yeah, and that was something I was going to say about this particular sample. It's got like you don't miss the vocals, right? There are no vocals there. And that's not because the vocals are bad. I kind of like them. There's this weird cryptic purr, right?
Yeah.
It's just instrumental, and the interest is all. There's no like, oh, this would be heavier or more aggressive if the vocals were there. It's just like, wow, this part's really interesting, and it's cool that you get to hear the whole thing.
Yeah, I feel like when they drop out vocals on this record, it's to indicate to the listener to pay attention, because there's a lot of there's a lot of this record
right.
that's
it's the opposite of what usually it is. When it's like when the vocals come in, it's kill time, right? That's how it works on an old school black metal record or on a death metal
or a hardcore record for that matter.
Yes, for sure. Yeah.
In this case, it's
you repeat the riff 4 times and then.
Yeah. In this case, like they understand that this is a brutal death record that is meant to be listened to like a black metal record. You're not supposed to like hone in super hard on it, I think. I think you're supposed to let it wash over you a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's right. But it rewards detailed listening too.
Yeah, it does too.
This weird writing.
So, with that said, let me get into my favorite track of the record that I sampled from, which is the final track, the title one, Coproporeal, which is a little bit longer than most of the tracks. But, damn, I think this is the one where they really...
Is it the epic?
At 3.5 minutes, it's the epic.
Yeah.
So let's listen to this, and we'll talk a little bit about how this music is structured top-down. Oof. That's
a lot of slams.
It's a lot of slams, but I find it very interesting that for a regular slam band, the slams release tension. You know, they're the explosive moment that you mosh to. In Induced, the slams build tension. You don't feel comfortable. You don't feel like you're going to mosh to this. It's like, it's almost stressful listening to that passage for me, because it's like, oh man, you get these little micro ideas that keep evolving and you're not sure.
You got slams that ascend, right?
Yeah. There's
this continually rising slam where usually it's like, this is the low part, the slam.
Yeah. I mean, it's got this it's got this quality of what I like to think of as like animal panic. Like there's a predator in the room and you're a rabbit, which is something I associate a lot with the first couple Cryptopsy records, where these songs just keep ratcheting up, and they never really release until the very end. You know, which is a cool way to structure death metal that's completely different from that rock and roll peaks and valleys style.
Yeah, I mean, there definitely are some big riffs on this album that I actually wanted to, maybe on track 5 or 6, I actually wanted to highlight some of those, but it's, one with 2 samples a person, and, I just want to point out that there's actually some interesting kind of more meaty sort of, not classically death metal in any way. In some ways, the way that their riffs are good when the emphasis is on the riff is like a hardcore riff. Right? Very huge emphasis on just precise interval choice, right? Every chord interval counts. And there's some stuff that's like, there's a weird semi-melodic major key bit. Do you remember that one?
Oh, yeah,
it's just like big chunky major key chording. That's pretty cool. And it was surprisingly kind of, that on a record like this, it was a surprising kind of horns up moment, right?
Yeah.
But, so I guess I want to go with the last sample. This is a part I really like. And I think this is when I was like, oh god, I actually just really like this ultra brutal death metal band, and I'm going to listen to it again.
Nice.
And this converted me. And it continues the idea of this sort of ratcheting and building slams. I guess I call them chord ladders.
Yeah,
I think is a thing
just
that
like
uses
ascending spiraling thing.
Yeah, or ascending stairways. Like just tier and tier and tier, stacking chug. So let's listen to how that's used here, and then how it's followed up on, which is just sick.
Yeah,
epigenic self-inoculation.
Alrighty. It's interesting because I'm reaching back on that opening riff. There's another like Cryptopsy phrase in there. That little that's
You mean the trem part at the end?
Yeah, the trem part at the end of that riff, because that's how Cryptopsy ends so many of their riffs on the first couple records, and they don't. Yeah, they don't necessarily link up to the main melody, but they're just these little, like, staccato, like, anxious, like, panicked endings.
That's almost, yeah, that relates to a similar thing that is like, a thing Bolt Thrower does, and that I do in a lot of riffs I write. Sometimes I have to remind myself not to do it, which is just like, you have a phrase and then you end it with just this kind of punctuation mark, right? So Bolt Thrower will be like, vwam, vwam.
Yeah.
It's,
the charge up, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. The charge up, which is usually, it's often sick, but you can do it in this kind of pro forma way. But so what I really like they're doing the chord ladder thing, but over Furious Blast, right?
Yeah.
He's basically tremming slams.
Yeah. The down-picked chord stuff on this is ridiculous from a right hand perspective. It has as much sort of
pulsed chromatic, like it's hard to hum because it's so chromatic. And it, it's the level of like detail in a part where like a modern classical piece goes really crazy or something.
Yeah.
It's, it has that pulse. Yeah, I guess it's really pulsed in the way a lot of 19th century music is, actually. There's a strangely organic for mecha-death metal.
Yeah,
And I love the call and response, this sort of double idea between the chord stacking and then that high squalling tremolo, the boom, the cryptopsy thing, because that pops in a little hint of melody there. Right, a little goes a long way.
I like they use melody to it. I mean, it sounds stupid, but they kind of use melody to indicate the lack of melody in the rest of the music. You know what I mean?
Sure, it's the exception that confirms the rule.
Yeah.
But it's also rewarding when it happens. And it's like even just that little flourish at the end is cool. And what? All of this music has a cool thing about it. It's like once you're it's been, black metal and death metal have been around a while, right? We've talked about this before, and it's like, and they've had some dark days, right? For death metal. Both of them were pretty dark days in the early 2000s, late 90s.
Yeah.
Mid 2000s, I think shit only really started to pick up again around 2012. And obviously there were great bands in the wilderness during that time. But yeah, for the listeners, I'm not just dissing everything from that time. But one has to think about how do you keep writing new kinds of riffs, right, while remaining faithful to this tradition. And one way of doing it is like writing riffs that are really hard to hum.
Yeah.
And so things that are kind of blurry, things that are less like discrete notes on a staff and more like these energy pulses.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you think of this style as basically death metal freeing itself from the need to be articulate and to, I mean, you know what I mean?
Well, they are playing notes. That's the thing. You do it by really detailed playing.
Yeah.
But
so, I mean, if you get down to it, old school death metal is riff-based in a way that, a lot of rock music is riff-based, and I don't necessarily have a problem with that, but if you want to break out of that form, I've always argued that, here's pretentious. I've always thought that a lot of this extreme...
Yeah, it's weird that our most pretentious content is the ultra-brutal death metal. Always.
I feel that in a lot of ways, this ultra-brutal style resembles something like early 20th century modernist classical music in a way. This completely divorcing yourself from conventional ideals of melody and rhythm in the same way that noise music does.
Yeah, and I think it's, black metal, one reason black metal gained kind of extreme metal hegemony, right, was that it freed itself from the riff. Yeah. And it had this incredibly open compositional style, right, that death metal bands had to incorporate. Well, here's a way to do something that's parallel to that, but not that at all. Sort of organically, it comes from within death metal. So I want to play a sample of another band that does this really well, and that, the more raw metal segment of the audience will really like. If you haven't heard this is one of my favorite records from last year, and I think one of the most original new sounds in black or death metal I've heard. This is Concrete Winds. They used to be in Forum, a pretty good Finnish OSDM band. And this has a quality like the Induced. This is a quality I call music adjacent. All right, so let's go to, it has that blurred quality.
Yeah.
Unhummable. Let's go to White Cut Manifest.
Okay, well, I know you've mentioned them on the show before, but I have to listen to that record because that is like almost like a perfect fusion of you and me in the stuff we like in that kind of stuff.
That's like if I were a more proficient guitarist, that would be our band.
That is hyper fucking brutal. Way more brutal
than ourselves a huge compliment, right?
Well, it's like it's so much more brutal than most of what we call war metal these days.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely! It's so much more engaged,
and it's a great way to bridge these sort of 80s ideas with modern extremity.
Yeah. So, like, what I love about this is that they lead with this sort of the rhythm riff. The part I'm really interested in parallel into the Induced is once it starts shifting into these trading. Yeah, let's talk about that part first, right? It's, you know, it starts off with this ripping part for context, and then you get into this part where you're you're sort of trading between these squalling trem riffs and these stacked chugging chords below.
Yeah.
And both the trems and the chugs, it's difficult to make out their shape, right? Because they have these unusual kind of chromatic shapes that aren't attempting to do normal riffy things. But everything here satisfies the need that you have from riff-based music, right? These are riffs being played in a way that, this is why I say music adjacent. It's moving in perfect parallel to conventional melodic riff music.
Yeah,
but without... You go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, just as an aside, I said it while we were listening to the sample, but most of those riffs could be on a Brutal Death record. They are not conventional black or death metal riffs. Honestly, it's more of the aesthetic that makes it like Black and Death, and the fact that it's a little more restrained in tempo.
Production.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the production and the fact that they recorded it. You can tell they're playing live, basically, right?
It's like, if we kick that up 20% in speed and give it more sterile production, that's a Brutal Death record, you know?
Yeah, I think that's just one of the best things that's come out in a number of years.
That's awesome.
And the beginning, so yeah, you can hear... So you can hear this squalling quality in the leads, right?
Yeah.
And that's the most clear at the beginning, the thrashing part that begins it, and then that we rolled towards the end, right? The rhythm guitar is playing what is technically a sort of 80s speed hardcore riff, kind of. It's like a speed metal riff played with discharge, minimalism, and dissonance. But, like, what's happening over it is the star. It's like, first of all, if you don't like Kerry King solos, get the fuck out. Second of all, this is like Kerry King solo turned into a method of writing riffs.
Yeah.
Right? The sort of squalling, bending, just screaming lead guitar. And it has that quality throughout. And I think the Induced has this too in its own way. Throughout, it has that quality that you identified when we were talking about Viola par la signe or whatever. Yeah. You pointed out that I liked this kind of arcing electric current sound in guitars.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And so it's just generally, I like the feel when the guitar tone starts moving like this flowing, bending energy.
Yeah.
Or maybe not, that's very organic. That's very sort of flowy metaphors, but, Discharge has it too with these kind of jagged structures.
Yeah, right? You like the heat. Yeah.
Yeah, I like the heat, man. It's, and, I like, and, when the energized quality of it overrides some of the traditionally musical qualities of it, and stuff that has live guitar playing, right?
Yeah.
Like, you could hear it in the Induced, right? Those sort of like, those little the sort of smeary leads that the cryptopsy thing, you can hear the live quality in the playing, you can hear bending, it's just and Induced works like this too. It's just like it's just on a scale from, say, like an abstract noise black metal band like VPLC to Concrete Winds to Induced. Induced is just the most solid.
Yeah. It's the most physical.
It's the most just purely, it's massified.
Yeah.
Right? It's like blocks. And it's kind of in the same way that it's like moving adjacent to conventional music, all these bands.
Mm-hmm.
I would describe this as the feeling of, like, we've talked about intense corporeality as the uniquely death metal feel, right? Talked about that in episode 8, if you're interested in it, and in episode 2. In this quality, it's like inorganic life.
Yeah.
Is its sort of corporeality. It's like you're watching something that's not alive, like metal or scrap metal, doing sort of living things, right?
Yeah, it's Tetsuo the Iron Man,
Yeah, and so for everyone who sort of complains about, the sterility of mecha-death metal, I see where you're coming from, but, like, here's a record in the Induced that is intensely and perversely alive.
Yeah, right? But it's a thing that shouldn't be alive, and you feel wrong when you watch it.
Yeah. Also, about Concrete Winds, also, they're one of the most aptly named bands ever, because that's about how you can describe their guitar tone. That is a great name,
right? Yeah.
It's like, that's that sort of inorganic, but sort of flowing, inorganic but natural, like wind, and also concrete, just like wall of shit. Just, torrent of concrete that sort of bends and pulses and moves in this way. And their track titles have this kind of abstraction too. We've got, like, sulfuric upheaval, primitive force, sort of volcanic turmoil, angelic laceration, tyrant pulse.
Yeah.
They all their song titles communicate a sense of how the music works.
Yeah. Well, that was a great review of Concrete Winds.
Oh yeah, sorry, I was about to apologize, but yeah, just snuck that one in there.
All right, well, I think it was all good stuff, but I think it's a good place to wrap it up for Induced. Yeah. Let's take a short break, and we'll be back with Siege Column. Okay, and we're back, and we're going to be talking about the new Siege Column record. That's a band that I'm not familiar with at all until now. So you want to give a little bit of background?
Yeah, Darkside Legions. Yeah, so it comes from this, I don't know if there's a name for this, I think there is a name for this group, I can't remember what it is, but it comes from this New Jersey scene centered on Joe Aversario, and I think his pseudonym used to be Tom G. Warrior, he just really went for it, but I think it's maybe now Tom Warrior or something. But these two dudes and other people they know who have this rotating cast circle of bands that they go for weird old school, eccentric old school sounds, right? Their first band, or one of their first bands, was Dethroned Emperor, which was like a strange, chopped up, grindy version of Hellhammer, with very, lots of time not like fancy time changes, but lots of changing parts, right? Yeah. And they've had their most conventional band, saying something, is Death Fortress, where they like totally get inside Roman Senko's guitar style and just write new riffs within it, and it's really, and they build it out. It's like, so it's like, it's not just Hate Forest worship. It's like if there were another Hate Forest album that was, and they get into stuff like Hades and whatnot too. So that's a fantastic band that I really respect. And they have these other projects that have this kind of brutal 80s barbarian black speed death thrash kind of thing going on, which I think for the purposes of this show, we'll just call 80s filth.
Yeah.
I didn't plan on this, but I actually made a YouTube playlist. I've been making YouTube playlists for the show, and I think the best one I've made so far, the most useful one, is an 80s filth playlist that I'm going to keep building out. So they have this, it's all this spectrum from war metal to old school thrash. It all goes together for them. And they're sort of wedded to raw production and impulsive playing.
Yeah.
So Siege Column is, I guess, maybe it's Joe Eversario and one other guy. I should probably pull his name up on Metal Archives because I think he might be actually the main songwriter.
He is Sean Slot Skull Crusher.
Oh, yeah. Okay,
pretty good name.
Respect to that. And then Sean Slott is doing guitars, vocals, and bass, and then Joe is doing guitars, vocals, and drums. So it looks pretty collaborative. But a lot of their other projects they just put out by themselves or on small labels. This is one of their Nuclear War Now bands, so this is getting promoted more. And we've got this doesn't come out for a couple weeks, and they've got a full album stream coming up somewhere.
Yeah.
So I think what we're going to go with to err on the safe side is we're just going to play the two songs that are already out there. We're not going to sample from other stuff.
Yeah.
And so these are two songs that came out on, you can stream them on No Clean and Singing if you want. Let's lead off with you. What were your general thoughts on this record?
So, this is a record where... Well, were you going to say something?
Oh, I was just going to say, you are as the standard bearer of mecha-death metal, you are also our leading skeptic of attempts to recreate old school death metal. Right?
Well, that's one of the interesting things is, for me, this record, in a large part, doesn't even really scan as death metal. What I really get from this record is a lot of sort of extreme 80s thrash, a lot of Celtic Frost and Hellhammer, and honestly a lot of just hardcore punk, leaning into the metal side, stuff like Cro-Mags. But I don't really get an attempt at real old school death metal. I mean, we're talking about like extreme kind of 80s death thrash at most.
Yeah, I think the term 80s filth is probably not a bad term for it.
And so I'm going to openly admit that this whole aesthetic and this whole idea is basically like as far from what I'm into as it gets. So take all my critique of this with a grain of salt. I don't hate this record, but there are issues that I take with it. So the way I read this music is, it is an attempt to...
Maybe before we go to that, I'll do my take and we'll do a sample.
Okay, so let's do that.
I'm very sympathetic to this mix of styles. It's stuff I like a lot. It is... And like we talked about on the last show, right? I'm interested in the idea of how do you go back to old school stuff without slavishly reconstructing something.
Yeah.
Siege Column are clearly trying to do that. They're trying to bridge together, they're trying to make an 80s or pre-92 extreme metal album that nobody made.
Yeah.
Right? And that's a good goal. I really like... I think some positives for me are the extremely sort of live playing. There's riff styles on this that I like a lot, which we'll get into. And I think they often have bass forward sound, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah.
I like the sound quality on this album a lot. But I think I share my co-host's reservations about some of the some of the style and songwriting stuff on this project.
All right, so let's just jump in with one of the tracks we're allowed to show, and this is called Funeral Fiend. So let's just run that through.
We can play the whole track for you because it's already been streamed. So
yeah, there we go.
Get ready. to you like that song started 3 times?
Yeah, it's sort of like there's an episode of The Office where Michael Scott is talking about starting speeches, and he says, "I'm not sure, I'll usually draft a few intros, and then I just decide to do all of them."
Yeah, it's sort of. Yeah, you got the you had the ambient, keyboard spooky intro, and then you have the sort of the Hellhammer riff. That first Hellhammer riff that comes in there is really good. It's got a lot of detail in it, which I like. Then it switches to that weird guitar solo, the sort of lead part, and sits on it for a minute while it's still doing that mid-tempo riffing thing. I'm not sure the lead adds much there. That's like about the track car last week when I complained about that one lead that was just hanging out.
Yeah.
This is like rhythm guitar music, right? This band especially.
Yeah.
Rhythm guitar and guitar solo. And then it stops, and then it blasts off into a D-beat part.
Yeah.
And I feel like in the middle of this song, there's a good Master or Death Strike style ripping sort of proto-death song. Did you hear that?
Yeah, well, yeah, we touched on that with our drag car review last week, which is interesting because there's a whole discussion to have. Is this like a thing that's coming? Is like, you see, I guess in my like uninformed take, I would call it like punky death metal in general, which is a thing that's existed for a long time, but seems to be making a resurgence, and not to sound like a dick, but it seems like a lot of people online, a lot of like tastemakers are acting like this is the first time we've heard it. But really what I would compare a lot of this music to, like the parts that I really enjoy, is Nunslaughter. A band that's been around forever, but nobody gives a shit about. Like, for instance, have you ever listened to...
people who are really... I've never listened to an Unslaughter album. However...
Yeah, no, I get it.
But people who are really into the underground do listen to Nunslaughter records. I mean, many are.
I think
also,
you would love it, because it's very, like... It's just a pure fusion of punk and death metal, really. It's...
Yes.
It's got a real essence, and that is where this record succeeds. Is when it's like high tempo and aggressive and natural.
Yeah, the D-beat part in the middle is really good, and one thing that sets it apart and makes it like Master is it's like even more dissonant than Discharge riffs. Right?
Yeah.
It's got that kind of speedy Bathory liquid feel that you don't have in Discharge, but it's like a Bathory riff that's being played more with power chords and has just the most crushing intervals possible.
Yeah, Master. Yeah.
Death Strike really wrote half the songs.
Well, yeah. But but that style, Master riffs do not make any fucking sense. Like, on a very fundamental level. Like Master is early music adjacent,
Yeah, true, in a great way, yeah. Mangled dehumanization.
But I guess, so those are the good parts of the record. Honestly, I think that...
The song sort of goes away after that, right?
Yeah. Well, honestly,
yeah.
Listening to the whole record, I think this is one of the weaker tracks on the album. Honestly, it's kind of weird that it was like a promo track, because I don't think it's nearly as strong as some of the stuff on the first half of the album.
It's like a teaser, maybe.
Yeah, but I guess my issue is, so at its best, this record sounds like sort of a war metal take on Nunslaughter. But at its worst, it sounds a lot more like...
war metal take on Nunslaughter might be the most sort of NWN/Hell's Headbanger.
Yeah, definitely.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But at its worst, this record sounds like Deceased, which is a band I have never been able to stand.
What's Deceased?
Oh, you don't know Deceased?
No, I'm a naive.
Oh, it started as like, sort of like, kind of like clumsy death thrash, and then went in more of this like heavy metal meets death metal direction, but not in kind of like the groovy sense that you would imagine now. Like a very like oblique mixture of like Judas Priest and death metal. It's very weird. But it has this like dedicated cult fan base. And those are the parts where I think this record falls down, is when it commits too heavily to this sort of like punk and heavy metal structure, and which grinds against this kind of blown out war metal aesthetic. You get what I mean?
Maybe let's listen to the. I mean, because I like to me, yeah, the parts that sound best are like the ripping hardcore-ish parts. But
Yeah.
by punk you mean like bouncy punk rock. You mean like GBH, whatever, right?
I mean, maybe to a degree, but even imagine just like the first couple Iron Maiden records, the sort of like Brit punk that they were influenced by.
Yeah, that's GBH, or they were. Yeah, sure.
I've never listened to GBH, so you know.
Oh, you'd like it more than I do.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's listen to the
like melodic discharge.
Yeah. Well, let's listen to the title track, and we'll give that a try, and that'll give us some points of comparison.
Yes.
Okay. Darkside Legions.
This kind of fragmented quality to it, right?
Yeah.
I feel like on this record, I keep hearing riffs that I like a lot, and then other riffs that just don't do as much. And, part of it's my ear. But it seems like there's a lot of changing of riffs going on, but there's either too many or too few ideas. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because I feel like this is very, the way this music is constructed is very blocky, almost like blockier than the 80s bands that it's inspired by. And they're attempting
like
to be
4 of this, 8 of that.
Yeah. And but more so, it's like I can. There's techniques they're using to transition and to extend ideas, like these sort of like dive bomb micro solos that are both Kerry King and Blasphemy, which is I'll fully admit not something I enjoy. But
You don't like Kerry King solos?
I like Kerry King solos in the context of Slayer songs, but I don't like when just these sort of like dive bomb things keep popping up, which is something that happens a lot in bands like
Revenge
this.
does that a lot.
Yeah. You know, and it's like my least favorite part of Revenge songs. So basically, I guess here's my thesis. So this is an attempt to rejoin sort of a war metal aesthetic to its roots in 80s music, which is like Blasphemy. Blasphemy is at its core 80s like death black thrash metal, just taken way too far.
Blasphemy is kind of like a hardcore band too. Like they were all skaters. Yeah.
But it's like, but it's really hard to square the circle of this aesthetic with how kind of like restricted the songwriting style is, if that makes sense. Like, I'm not a big Blasphemy fan, but the reason why people love them is how wild it is. And I don't know if I get that.
Blasphemy is really intense. Yeah.
I don't know if I get that wild quality off this. This strikes me way more like something like Venom or Possessed in a sense.
Venom is also wild though, right? At its best.
At its best it is.
Right.
Not consistently, but, you know.
Right, no, riding our stallions bareback and free, taking our chances with ridership. You know, that's wild, right?
Yeah.
That's wild. I feel like the ripping parts are sick. On this particular song, I feel like a lot of the rhythm riffing I didn't like as much as the Death Strike stuff in the middle of the last song.
Well, I think that this band might be at their best when they're being sort of a hardcore band in general.
Yeah, more D-beats.
Imagine me saying that. You know?
True. More D-beats, but also, I think some of the blasty riffs have that kind of on some of the different tracks. I think I made some notes here. I really like Echoes from the Underworld, which is track 2, often the strongest track on a record, right? You put in track 2. Echoes from the Underworld has this, it has that Master or Death Strike quality, but it's blasted, which makes it a lot more abstract and dissonant than often the kind of blast beat riffing you get in 80s bands.
Yeah.
Certainly more so than, Celtic Frost or Possessed or Venom.
Yeah.
Right? And, sort of, you can hear that proximity to hardcore and to grind in some of the blasting parts.
Yeah.
So that's a creative thing, I think, is incorporating that extreme proto-death dissonance into the blasting and making these kinds of deliberately blocky, sort of blocky by choice, sort of big crushing dissonant chord change interval riffs. That I like. And it is Snakeskin Mask at the end of that they have too. So in some sense, it's like the blasting parts that are more like transposing hardcore ideas to blast, and also that just sound more like war metal.
Yeah.
But are better often than war metal riffs, because so many war metal riffs hang out around, da, da, da.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and honestly, I think you're saying, Snakeskin Mask. I'll say a lot of the problem with reviewing this right now is the fact that we're restricted to these 2 tracks, because I feel like the front half of this record is a lot stronger. Mm-hmm. I like Echoes from the Underworld. I like Snakeskin Mask. And later on, I like Gloves of Fire a lot.
That's a good track title.
That's a good, it's
this
cool.
This band is good with track titles. I'll say that. Also, their first record had a track called Blasting the Moongate.
That's pretty sick.
The most metal track title about sex I've ever heard.
That should be a Beharit song,
Yeah. Well, bro, you can't leave. Sorry, bro, gotta punch out, man. I gotta go home and blast the Moongate.
But I guess, honestly, man, a lot of my critique of this record does come down to kind of aesthetic things, because I'm really not the target audience for this at all. And I'm at the point where I can kind of like accept that, and I can battle against it, I can argue about this music, but I'm just not who this is for. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess I'm closer to being who this is for. I think the combination of ideas here I generally like.
Yeah.
I think the rawness, the organic sound, the rumbling bass, and as we've said, these sort of ripping Deathstrike Master stuff I think is awesome, and you don't hear a lot of bands doing that.
Yeah.
Right? And the blasted versions of that. So those things I like a lot. I think I'm very supportive of this circle of guys in general. I think they just do interesting stuff, and they've always been very under the radar, very sort of underground ethos, and worth supporting. So I definitely think we should keep track of what they're doing.
Yeah, definitely.
But I think this particular project, it's not really gelling for me. And I think, if there was one of my more specific things that I wish there was less of, it would be kind of like, they have some really battering mid-tempo riffs that are well-written, good intervals, stomping, boom-da, boom-da, Hellhammer in the shadow of the horn stuff. And then some parts where they keep the mid-tempo up, but they relax it. And you get these leads coming in over. And that's just not, for me, cancels the good part of it.
Yeah, no, I get what you mean. Yeah, so overall, it's not an album that I hate, but I can just acknowledge, like, I've definitely started to listen to more stuff like this just from, through osmosis of, talking to you and writing with you and stuff, but this is still, a little bit too 80s for my appreciation. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay, so we've done that one, and now we are going to move on to Disavowed right after a short break.
All right, so Disavowed, Revocation of the Fallen, out on Brutal Mind. Like I said up top, so Disavowed's a Dutch brutal death band. Their first record, Perceptive Deception, from 2001, is kind of a classic among people who are really in the know about brutal death metal. So it was interesting to check these guys out. They've been gone for about 13 years. Perceptive Deception is a favorite of mine. It's been really kind of inspirational to me in the way that I write brutal death stuff. And I was definitely interested to try it out. So what was your kind of impression of these guys as a whole?
I feel like I've been able to get, as we talked about at the beginning, I've been able to get much more of an appreciation for stuff like this as the show's gone on, and as I've listened to more full albums of stuff like this that you like. I think for me, let's see if I can place this relative to things we've covered on the show already, right?
Yeah.
So this is kind of like it's brutal death, and the last really brutal death thing we did was Oncology, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is like the Oncology from Northern Ireland, but it's much less. Oncology I found very enjoyable because it was brutal death that was rooted also in, like Slayer and in kind of first, like, classic 1992 death metal ideas. It had this, it was going to satisfy your basic sort of headbanging, ripping death metal urges. This is different to me. So to me, I think this sounds a lot more. I guess my overall impression is like, I am not the target audience for this. And it sounds to me, this is, although I've now opened my mind to this whole sort of mecha-death metal thing, this is more like the stuff that, I would hate on back in the day as sort of extremely highly technical, sort of not kind of, kind of deliberately sterile sounding brutal death. And so I had a harder time getting my hooks in it, and I think I've got a few possible explanations for that we can get into as well.
Well, that's fine.
But sample time?
Well, yeah, sample time, but real quick, let's get where these guys are coming from.
Sure.
Let's listen to the opening track off their first record, Perceptive Deception. This is a track called Rhizome. So let's just listen to the...
Deleuze and Guattari.
So let's just... I have no idea what you mean, but okay. So let's just listen to the first minute or so of this as a kind of a comparison piece to this newer stuff.
Particular version of Disavowed.
Yeah, and that's one that was unbelievably brutal in 2001. It's
still
just
pretty damn brutal.
Yeah, it's still very extreme. It's just the production's kind of flat nowadays. So Disavowed is a Dutch band, but what they're really doing is they're drawing from an extension of like New York death metal. And especially Midwestern death metal, a style that was, or Midwestern brutal death rather, that was centered around a label called United Guttural, which had a lot of bands from like Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois who played a very sort of hyper-modern, sterile variety of brutal death without a lot of groove to it. So in a sense, this is kind of
Did you know that there's a band from Germany called the Ohio Slam Boys?
Oh, well, I'll have to check them out.
Isn't that a great band name?
That is good.
All right.
So what's interesting to me about this record, and about Disavowed in general, though, is that unlike Induced or unlike the brutal death bands we covered on the last episode, this is really just old school death metal turned to 11. This is just more speed, more intensity, more extreme vocals. It doesn't have that, like, distinct, separated quality that a lot of these brutal death bands do that we cover on the show.
Well, specifically, that first track definitely the Rhizome sounded really just like very fast old school death metal.
That's true. So, for comparison...
You're saying that about this new one, too?
To a lesser degree, but yes. And to make a comparison, let's listen to my first sample off this new record. This is off a track called The Enlightened One. And let's just give that one a try. Oh yeah, the vocal performance on this is one of the standout parts of the record.
That's maybe the only like super brutal high vocal I could describe as exasperated.
I like that. Well,
murderous commuter.
I did listen to this in the car several times on the commute to and from my job. So what's interesting here is the new Disavowed, basically they're more technical, but they're still leaning... Yeah, they're still leaning on New York death metal traditions from like Suffocation and Dying Fetus and stuff like that. So, but in the meantime, in their absence, they've been listening to stuff like Defeated Sanity, because you'll hear those little kind of jazzy flourishes here and there, or you'll hear they're gonna work with the grooves in a slightly different way. But one thing to talk about is the fact that this is not an album with big moments. There's not giant riffs. There's no like climactic narrative songwriting. It's just blocky, technical, brutal death for people who were listening to it back in the early 2000s, in a sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think to me, I liked the opening of that a lot. There were like 6 riffs that happened there. I honestly had a hard time keeping track. Some of them I liked, some of them not so much. It's they do a thing there, and they do it throughout the record, which I'll talk about in one of my samples, which is the bolt thrower charge up. The wah, wah.
Yeah.
And, honestly, let's just go to my sample. This is the beginning of the process of comprehension, and it has a cool, fast riff that I think does stand out more. And then I'll talk a little more.
All right, sure.
So that kind of that's very King Crimson-y, right?
Yeah, and
like
it's also
Felahunganji.
I mean, in a sense, it's also very like Morbid Angel to a degree. It's very honestly like Converge-y to a degree.
Yeah, yeah. I get that. Yeah, I'm sure they were really into the NYDM, right? They were from Jersey.
Yeah, and it's also a dying fetus technique you'll hear a lot. So, well, no, it's
just making sure Converge were from Jersey. My hardcore knowledge is always a little bit old. No, I fucked that up. I knew it. Massachusetts, 1990.
Well, Dying Fetus was from Maryland. I think we could say that whole
these
scene
are all
is
orbitals. Yeah, they're all related to New York and New Jersey.
It's more like a New England scene rather than
right. Yeah, right. What was Hatebreed was Connecticut.
Something like that. I think it's like they were instrumental in the Boston hardcore scene, but ultimately they weren't from Boston. I think.
Yeah, Hatebreed was from Connecticut. There, I got that one. It's but yeah. So it's got a very East Coast thing going on. I really like how they develop. So that little wiggly King Crimson bit, they develop in a nice way. The riff that follows it up is cool. All of these riffs are changing way too fast for me.
Okay.
But,
which is interesting because Oncology, I feel, changed just as fast, but I think those riffs have more body to them
and more continuity.
Yeah.
But there, I feel like the fast changes have some continuity because there are melodic ideas being developed. And there's there are a couple different really cool, elaborate riffs they throw in there before they return to the King Crimson-y part. And yeah, I think that part really works. It's dynamic and it's flowing and it sort of swoops you in and out of this trench.
Well, I feel like I can assume that probably your primary issue with this record is just how like these are just riffs stapled together. There is no effort made to make a kind of continuous song or a continuous narrative idea.
Well, and also just, again, too fast. It's like, I'll get to it more with my sample, but it's just spazzy.
Yeah.
And I think my standards for what constitutes spazzy have really adjusted as I've gotten older. Back in the day, I used to just avoid things that had basically interesting rhythmic ideas. I was just like insufficient thrash, ignoring, I really like, at least my particular version of ADHD is I like things that just sort of you can really lock into, right? So
I got you. There is absolutely no locking into this music. No.
Yeah, there's no sort of, and it's not, they don't just drop the riffs next to each other, but they're constantly doing, this almost annoys me more, they're constantly doing these fancy little change-ups in between them.
Yeah.
And that, to me, so some of this, almost like, Oncology might have changed fast, but there was this riffy development to it. And
much more organic.
It wasn't techy. This band is really techy. If I didn't know that it was considered brutal death, I'd consider it techy. And so it's like this is when my old sort of like punk dar goes off, and I'm like, this is proggy, this is techy, not for me.
I don't mind that. Well, let's listen to my second sample, which that gets into a little bit more some of the groovier territory of this record. So let's check out the sample off Imposed Afterlife.
That was like a continuous part for 30 seconds. That almost scanned to me. I liked that, right? And that reminded me of the early Disavowed track you played.
No, I think this is one of the strongest songs on the album, possibly the best. And I think that this evidences much more organic songwriting than a lot of the other tracks. Like, that segment felt very complete. It felt very put together. There's a logical sequence of ideas, even if it's...
a feeling of necessity.
Yeah, there is. And, there's just interesting ideas there, like, so what you heard at the beginning there is kind of Disavowed's version of a slam, which is more like a breakdown that you would hear from a band like Internal Bleeding, who are a great fucking band who I really love a lot and who are incredibly underrated. They're also from that New York scene, from Long Island. But the way they use it is, here the breakdowns are kind of like, they're transitional parts. They're not designed to be like climactic mosh parts. They are kind of transitional shapes to break things up before they progress into another like super fast part.
Although that is the thing I like about this record, that although it does have slams on it, it has a lot of these more traditionally moshy moments.
I would say
that also have a more conventionally riffy quality to them. Like at the end of Process of Comprehension, there's like these cool Morbid Angel inverted fifth things, and
because bands like Dying Fetus or Internal Bleeding are very like important to like formative slam death. Ultimately, the breakdowns are more like 90s beatdown hardcore, which is a lot of what you're going to hear here. And another thing that I appreciate is I really like the bass playing on this record, which is very tech and very in your face. And it reminds me, ironically, like Induced, of Cryptopsy, where Eric Langlois on bass was really pushed to the forefront of those early records, really making it like a competing voice with the guitars to make everything feel even more technical and just overbearing.
We got the black metal version of bass first a few episodes ago with Laetitia and Holocaust, right? Where they got this fretless bass that pops to the front in a lot of tracks as a melodic instrument.
Yeah, and there it's designed to kind of complement the music and give it this like flowing organic quality. Here it's to just like attack you in the way the guitars do.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I see what you mean. Because there it's like this fretless bass, so it almost has the most smooth melodic sound, and here it's like,
Here it's just punching you like every other instrument.
Percussive bass, right. So, here, I figured it's been a while since I, in particular, pulled a complaint segment of a song. On this show. So this is my this is what this next part sounds to me now how most music like this sounded when I was 17 and hearing it on college radio, or would hear
gotcha.
it incidentally afterward. So this is defractured in contemplation, although I would say it's like highly fractured.
All right, let's give that a try.
So you hear how choppy the first part of that is, right?
Yeah, but I will say, overall, like this, I think this might be where we diverge because this segment doesn't bother me at all. And I think that might just come down to having listened to this for so many years. I'm not saying you're wrong, but
I probably could have pulled a better example of it. Honestly, I think on a track or two before, there was just a part that really bored me, but I didn't pick it because it was boring.
Yeah.
It was, but this is, what happens here is it's really choppy at first. There's this kind of feint at a more, behemoth sounding riff, which I've pulled before from both Embryectomy and Oncology to be like, this is cool.
That like low tremolo riff that they do.
Yeah, low tremolo riff, dropping an octave to the chug, They feint at that at the beginning, and then it goes to this more really cool, flowing, groovy riff, this tremoloed groove riff, and I'm like, hell yeah, this is great. And I was like, nope, none of that. And then it locks into this hammering gent thing, and although stylistically not my favorite thing, I'm like, okay, this is a groove. It develops that. It starts to develop it really nicely. It actually brings in a cool, more flowing tremolo riff, and then junk. And so, to me, that's all sort of, it might not be the most egregiously choppy part on the album, but that, in a way, is the exception is proving the rule to me. It's like, here are good ideas sort of developing and then getting canceled by these stylistic conventions.
Yeah, I get it. And I think that really kind of a good summation of this is, I think this might be, because I'll say straight up my overall feelings, this is an okay record to me. Obviously, the first Disavowed record is like a very big record for me as a brutal death metal fan, and I don't really love this record. I think it's fine for what it is, and I'm interested in hearing where they develop it, if they like get a little more comfortable. You're coming off 13 years, you want to impress people. I think it might be going a little too far with a lot of its flourishes, but I think this might be a case kind of similar to the Siege column, where you're a little...
I see what you mean. Yeah, there's some...
Oh, no, I was just that you're more inclined to kind of accept that aesthetic, and I'm a little more inclined to accept this one, even if we aren't in love with it overall. Yeah,
for sure. Agreed. Yeah, I'm not going to say that, because I don't know this style, I'm not going to say, like, this is a bad record. I would say that I can't get into it, but I can get into parts of it, right?
Yeah.
And I think, like, there are cool riffing ideas on here that I like a lot. It's just a little too much. It's too much the thing it is for me.
I get what you mean.
It's just, this is, I am not the audience for this.
Hey, that's no problem.
Yeah.
And,
it's, what were you going to say?
Oh, no, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I guess we should just say, coming up, we are going to maybe take a micro break and then get into something for which both of us are the audience.
Oh, yes, we certainly are.
Indeed. All right. So we'll be back with Mortum's Atlantean Ouroboros, and which is probably the thing you came to hear.
Yeah, all right. We'll be right back. All right, and commencing
Autism Hour.
we have Mortum's Atlantean Ouroboros, an independent release. And how did you find these guys? Were you familiar with them before? Or?
No, I don't think so. This was a Bandcamp click around for me.
Okay.
I'm familiar with Folkvangr, who's released, I think, at least one of their albums before this, and is doing tape of this one. And I've known that guy's work for a while. He's got a really, as I said at the beginning, he's got a really good, interesting roster of bands. But I didn't even find it through Folkvangr. I think I just Mortum's page. Mortum is, sort of, in a general sense, one could compare it to Oppressive Dissent, who we had.
Yeah, to a degree.
It sounds nothing like... No, it sounds really, really different. But in the sense that it's American... Or Oppressive Dissent we reviewed on, I think, episode 8.
Yeah.
And I especially really like that one.
Yeah, I like that record.
Yeah, it's sort of dark and intense USBM. But I think we've got a lot of ideas about this, and so I think I want to just try to lead us into it with I've got some notes here, and I'm just going to try to rip through this little framing thing.
Like my pan slam theory from last episode.
Yes, this is my... Yeah, you got your grand unified theory of slam, so this is mine.
All right.
But, so I think, like, a question that we're interested in on this show, in general, is how do you make USBM? Because when we came up, in the earlier mid-2000s, right, that's when the media was, the metal media was trying to make this USBM phenomenon, right?
Yeah.
When sort of alternative culture, Inc. was getting its hooks in black metal. And there was everyone who's listening to this show knows there was like the New York bands with the Cascadian bands and all that crap. And, you may have bands from either of those scenes that you like. That's fine. We could argue about, we all have... There's
going to be some things from all of those that are worthwhile.
Exactly. And some ideas even in some of the bands that are bad that are worthwhile.
Yeah.
But like, it's... all in all, it was this pretty facile attempt to take existing black metal stereotypes and sort of go black metal plus, right? Had some extraneous gimmick or whatever, right? And for the most part, it didn't sound very American, right?
Yeah.
And it didn't sound very black metal. And yet there's been this real, since then, there's been this real sort of resurgence or surgence of American underground black metal where you can tell they're actually listening to European BM, paying attention to how they write riffs, and trying to write good riffs, right? And doing it all with this sort of, often with a hardcore or punk roots or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And so there are different sonic approaches to USBM, right? So you can do this sort of recklessly stompy, punky stuff that comes from Mysterious Guy. You can write music that's kind of polished and just embraces Screamo. Right?
Yeah.
Screamo being USBM sort of like secret, the secret ancestor of a lot of the early 2000s stuff, right? And, you could do, I've heard an interesting thing that I'd love to talk about more, which you could call bleak Ohio Rust Belt metal. I feel like some of the bands on Night Vision did that. But I think if you want to make black metal in the second wave Scandinavian and European tradition, right?
Yeah.
It sets, and to do so in a way where you're not just an American
imitating
successfully, and you could do it very successfully, right? I mean, Oppressive Dissent sounds really Euro. They just are a European band that happens to be based in Portland, right? And that's totally fine. And his take on Euro stuff is thoughtful and authentic and great. But, like, if you want to do something like that, we've got to find a way, like, the Scandinavian stuff in particular, which set the standard for all this stuff, is it's intensely rooted in particular place, particular culture with its own history, right? and sort of landscapes, all these sort of mythological reference points.
Yeah, and you've talked specifically about how, for instance, the idea of this kind of like screamo adjacent black metal is reflective of like U.S. suburban life outside of major metropolitan areas, which I think is a very interesting idea.
Yeah, so in some sense, the screamo-y stuff is very like, that's almost embracing the vagueness and anywhereness of America, right?
Yeah.
But on the other side of that, if you want to make stuff that plays the second wave game and advances that tradition, you've got a way to find a way to be rooted in a country that's founded in so many ways on uprooting, right?
Yeah.
You know, it's like you've got this kind of historically unique situation where people roll in, and they either kill or accidentally give diseases to a ton of the original inhabitants, right? Mm-hmm. And they kind of scorn their cultural legacy. It survived. There's really interesting crossover in a lot of ways, and some things survive, but there's not really an uptake of existing traditions.
Yeah.
Right? At least, and when it happens sort of as a response to the way that, say, Puritan Protestant American culture just steamrollers everything in front of it, right?
Yeah.
And then you've got this sort of 1776 thing, like, we found the correct values, we're starting history from the ground up, right? Yeah. You've got this creed of endless progress, and America is nation of immigrants, right? Now that can bring really interesting things to the table. It's a historically unique situation. You get interesting combinations of culture happening that way. Yeah. On the other hand, everyone has, sort of severed their roots in some way, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and America has this sort of tendency often to think very short term and very present day, right? Yeah. The internet's given us the word memory hole, right?
Yeah.
America has a gaping memory hole, right? So how do you make this sort of avant-garde but intensely rooted music in an American context in a way that's honest? The people who've been most successful thus far, you have to say, are the people who are just Indians, right? Or who can trace their descent to Indians or to indigenous...
mostly Latino dudes tapping into their, like, Indio heritage.
Aztec, Mesoamerica, South American kind of thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or Mexican, right? So Black Twilight was the beginning of this. Black Twilight Circle from, California, Southern California. At the beginning, back when we were coming up, I don't think they were that interesting, although they were really hot.
Yeah, I meant to ask you, because is Black Twilight more interesting? Because originally they felt very, kind of like Leviathan adjacent in a way.
I think they're not that much older than us. They are older than us, but, they're probably dudes in their later 30s.
Yeah.
And I think they were finding an aesthetic and sort of carefully trying to do weird variations on French things. I think they really came into their own when this kind of new wave of USBM really came into their own. It was around 2015. I saw Volon that summer, and Volon just absolutely crushed it. And they were playing music that was... I mean, it's the solo project of the one dude who calls himself Volon. But he has a band for live stuff, and it was an amazing show. There was really intense, aggressive energy, and they were playing this wild sort of, at once extremely Scandi and extremely spaghetti Western stuff.
Yeah.
And you could hear the Aztec vibe in it in a way you couldn't with the earlier stuff. Blue Hummingbird on the left also does this really well. Okay. Blue Hummingbird incorporates Aztec war flute and has just these pounding sort of melodic power chord riffs.
Okay.
Yeah, Blue Hummingbird's really good. So those that's in some sense like the gold standard for this sort of thing. And you've got a lot more bands doing things like that now. So you got Macuajitl is sort of sounds almost like it could be French, but it's very Aztec themed. And really elaborate French riffing. You've got a really new one called Ixaquitlan, who it's this kind of very almost Atmo black stuff, very melodic, but really, a little sugary for me, but a really good take on it.
Oh, so I should check them out. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, check them out. And then Ifernach, who I might mention later on, which is more like Nova Scotia shit. And the legendary black death metal band Migaus.
Who just to jump in, if you're listening to the show, you haven't heard Migaus, listen to that goddamn record, because it is outstanding.
Yeah. I think let's play some Migaus as our outro.
We'll do that. We'll do the first Migaus, the first track off the Migaus record. Yeah.
2003 Algonquian war metal. And then another variation on this is the Afro-Caribbean tradition, right? Mm-hmm. Because the people who were, when sort of the various empires brought African slaves to the Caribbean, right? They were sort of kept as a very separate population, right? They didn't have this. There was in North America, there was this effort to like Christianize everyone, sever their cultural roots, disperse them, break them up, attempt to enfold them into Protestant American culture, right? In the Caribbean, there's, sort of Afro-paganism survives, right?
Yeah.
Voodoo and shit.
Which I've always thought is very cool and should be introduced to metal more. Like, give me some fucking, like, Louisiana Santeria Black Death bands.
Well, and so they sort of, they've got that, and they've got African, direct African musical influence and whatever, and also it blends with indigenous stuff there too.
Yeah.
So the people who do that are House of First Light from New York City.
Yeah.
And the House of First Light is sort of top shelf, sort of scholarly black metal in a certain sense. Like, as with the guys in the Black Twilight Circle, they know that if you want to do something that is like the European BM tradition, but quite distinct, the way to do that isn't by sort of reactively doing the opposite or ignoring it or being like, fuck you, European black metal.
Yeah.
But by carefully and respectfully studying it and then building something that works adjacent to it, next to it, right? So you get the, maybe the most developed band for that scene is Sanguine Eagle, and it's just this intensely meditative version of Blazebirth Hall stuff. And
Sanguine Eagle fucking rules.
Yeah. So they've changed, and it's got these beastly growl vocals, and they've changed the energy so that instead of the sort of roaring tundra wind atmosphere of the BBH, right? They call it storm mysticism. It's like rotating, cyclonic, almost sort of like terrible feminine tropical heat energy.
I like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And they're just like, they give you absolutely nothing. It's totally remote, sort of remote music in a really interesting way, right? So, but what do you do? So, yeah, House of First Light is great, and other things from that group to check out. Hand of Glory was a good project.
Hand of Glory is also very cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually love a lot of that, because that also attaches to a lot of the stuff that I was talking about, like Sanguine Relic and that sort of like New England sort of like.
A split.
Oh, they did? Okay. Yeah.
I think they did.
I think, because when I was talking about Oppressive Descent a few episodes ago, I was talking about that whole, like, New England scene of melodic, like, vampiric black metal. I really like all that stuff.
Yeah, and Hand of Glory is, like, the more fucked, noise-gorked, sort of, like, Alaline version of that. There was other associated bands. There's a band called Vilcasis that doesn't have this Afro-Caribbean sound, or vibe to it. It's very Euro, but Vilcasis is the drummer Mike Rekovich. He fucking crushes. That's his solo project. So that's check out. But so here's the question, right? For USBM, what do you do if you're just a white guy? or a non-white guy who just wants to continue the second wave style, right?
Yeah.
And, who's like, I want to do something that sort of sounds meaningfully connected to this Euro BM tradition and is also American, right? What do you do?
Yeah.
Well, one possible answer is, if, we've had Indians, we could have cowboys, right? So, I think the one
there you get Finn. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Finn has this thing where they play Finn from Chicago, the dearly departed, wonderful band, where they're sort of, their imagery appears, it's like sort of Clint Eastwood but with machine guns, and like the cowboy is recast as, like, the American knight, because the riffs are just these extraordinarily florid Franco-Finnish riffs, right?
And then you've got the connection to, like, Spite Extremewing there, with how they develop, like, this spaghetti western melodic style.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, Finn is very much like Spite Extremewing in a lot of ways. It has that kind of manly, flamboyantly manly quality, right?
Yeah.
And so, swashbuckling. But then, okay, but one thing black metal is really about is about the, cowboys also are very connected to some of you can make cowboys cool, but they're also connected to some of the most annoying things about American culture, right? And they're also just sort of installed in the mythos of, like, the mythos of sort of ahistoric America, right? Uprooted America. What do you do? Well, black metal is often really into, like, the implausible fringe hypothesis, right? Or you take the crazy conceit and you just go with it.
Yeah.
So what about Vikings? Right? Right? The idea being, like, Vinlandic black metal. Right?
Just sort of rapacious and conquering,
Yes, rapacious and conquering, but in a different way, right? When the Vikings came to the New World, they're actually mostly just looking for timber.
Yeah.
And they just, in some sense, who knows who started it, right? But they were just looking for timber, and Vikings being Viking, they weren't raiding. You would never want to raid so far away from supply chains and supply lines against people you don't know. And, you want to raid the guys who have big gold crosses in their godhouses. But, like, they were looking for timber, and, they traded with the Indians and talked with them, but they also fought each other. The Vikings eventually had to withdraw because they were, way overextended.
Yeah. It's a long way from Iceland. Yeah.
And so, even from Iceland, right? But there was this... The Vikings the Vikings went everywhere as conquerors, or potential conquerors. Like, hey, could we conquer those people? What do you think? They didn't have this idea of sort of cultural superiority or sort of disinterest in what was already there, right? And they actually it wasn't the feeling of a new world. They knew where it was. It was Utgard. Right? It was giant land. And they had a word for the people who lived there. They called them Skraelings. Well, that's what they called Laplanders, too, or like Sami people. They knew exactly who lived in the New World because they'd already traded with and been culturally influenced by these people.
Yeah.
In Siberia, in Finland and Siberia and parts of Sweden and Norway. So, what if you reimagine America rooted in this kind of, European heathen tradition comes to the U.S. and sort of adapts to it, right? How do you bring the new gods to the old gods to the new land? So, number one example, Pagan Hellfire. Fucking sick band from, I think also from the Nova Scotia area.
Yeah.
Basically the whole Tour de Garde roster, right? Are doing
a lot of which I enjoy, some of which I really dislike.
Yes, I think some of it's really overhyped. Yeah, I think, Fortress is, I think, the most commercially successful.
I was thinking more like a Kitsa. But
yeah, I think Akitsa also is, good in concept, don't like the execution. Tour de Garde didn't quite get it, I think, but has a lot of good bands on it, too, and it's been really important.
Yeah.
And I think, but as far as, like, but I think the question is, you need sonic markers for this style, right?
Yeah.
How do you musically transplant this sort of North European tradition? And so that's something we can explore through Mortum. And I think I'll bring in some other bands.
Through finally getting to the album we're talking about.
Yeah. Let's get to the album we're talking about, and then I'll eventually get to a few other bands that do things like this. Let's rip with the sample and then give your overall take on it. Does that sound good?
Yeah, no, that sounds good. Okay, so should I just start with my sample in that case?
Yeah, let's go. And this is I extended the sample a bit, so this will give you a good idea of the range of styles on the album.
Yeah, so this is off. I basically took the samples off my 2 favorite tracks on the album, and this is one of my favorites. This is called The Crowned Serpent Rises from the Boiling Sea. So let's check that out real quick. Yeah, it's very good. So, to get into, I won't take, 15 minutes, but here's...
Oh, you did with the slam.
I did with the slam, yeah. But so basically, my impression of this record is that I find it super interesting. Interesting enough that I think there's weak points to this record. Like, I think the first couple tracks in particular are kind of weak compared to the rest of the record. But this might still end up on my, top 10 of the year, just because I like what I like so much. So, in short, this is a record where there's obvious flaws, but they're kind of fundamental to their charm, the songwriting tends to be kind of inelegant. It's very blocky, and some of the instrumental performances are kind of choppy, which doesn't bother me a great deal, just because it gives me the sense, okay, these are guys who have day jobs, and they get together once a week, and they're, writing and kind of, jamming these songs out, which is fine. There's a distinct, amateur or rehearsal room quality to this, which is not... a bad thing, but it requires a certain perspective to enjoy.
Could you give an example of that from, the sample we just played, right? Because the last riff does not have that. The last riff is an extremely elegant, top-tier, sort of Finnish, French kind of thing. Right?
No, yeah.
It could almost be an oppressive descent riff.
It's definitely not from the samples I chose, but there are choppier parts. If I wanted to bring them out, I could. It's not...
Here, well, maybe we can use my sample, because then the reference point you've got works well with it, too.
Okay, so the next one?
I see what you mean about sort of blocky and choppy. I would say I don't hear any flaws on this record. I just fucking love it. It's, if anything, maybe... I love that it's really loud.
These are flaws...
I love that it's really loud. It can be tiring to listen to, but it should be.
Well, they're flaws in a very, meta sense. If they were things that I gave a shit about, I don't care about, if your playing is, a little bit choppy occasionally, I don't care. I've done plenty of records like that.
So here's my way of, so here's the more sort of positive flip side of that, is that, it's not just that it's charming, I would say there's this, in terms of what makes an American black metal sound, phrase I kept thinking of as rough-hewn. These are all, rugged, simple American riffs.
Yeah.
Or a lot of them, right? And I'll get into that a little more after this sample. So this is from A Spirit Among Ruins. This is just, part one of these riffs leads off the album, but this is from later in the track.
Okay.
is similar to the trem in your sample.
Yeah.
It's really death metal, right?
Yeah, it
it's
is.
sort of low-end, single-string riffing. And, it can almost sound like it's... What you're saying about the choppiness on the plane, it almost sounds like it's being forced from the guitar.
Yeah.
Not in a... Do you know what I mean?
No, yeah, and honestly, something I didn't write down, but I would like to compare it to is a band that you like a lot from the USBM tradition, which is Fog. I think there's aspects of Fog on this record, this sort of like US imitation of Euro tradition, which paradoxically becomes very American in a sense.
Yeah. And it's like there's effort in it. And
there's a physicality to the playing.
It's extreme. That's what I love. It's extremely physical playing. I love physical playing, and some physical playing, like Spite Extreme Wing's really physical, but it's like you don't hear the instrument resisting them, right?
Yeah.
It's just an extension of their will, right? You can hear the string ringing with their spirit or whatever.
Yeah.
This is almost sounds like they're playing on medium or heavy gauge strings.
Yeah.
And just like they're in terms of that energy stuff we were talking about earlier, like this is like wringing the energy from a resistant substance.
Yeah.
And I keep coming back to the image of just like chopping wood.
Yeah.
Or carving,
Well,
lumberjack riff.
What's really interesting is that sample is a better example of the sort of adjacent sample that I have than my own, my previous sample. And this is something we talked about on the last episode, which was the very first Amon Amarth record.
Right? Yeah, we brought it up as a reference point for Drag Car, yeah.
But here it's even more important, because especially your sample, crucial to this comparison. So I've got a sample from Amon Amarth's Ride for Vengeance, the opening track off One Cent from the Golden Hall, which is, even if you're like an underground cool guy, listen to this album. It's outstanding.
It is an underground cool album, and there are awesome tracks on it.
So let's listen to the first minute of that real quick and draw comparisons from that.
Mm-hmm. Listen to Amon Amarth more again.
Have you not heard that record, like in full?
No, my God, no, I love it. It's just been a long time.
I fucking love that album.
No, that's a classic record. I just don't have it on my computer right now.
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot of that album's DNA in US black metal or melodic death metal. Just go ahead.
Yeah, well, no, go talk about Amon Amarth. Go.
So we touched on this last episode, but it makes a lot more sense on this record. So there's something structurally similar occurring on this Mortum record, which is that it's clearly melodic and consonant, but it's kind of ambitious in the way these riffs resolve. It's not the entirely conventional kind of Sargeist riffing, and no shitting on that, I love that. But there's something a little bit more mixed in the atmosphere and the mood. There's something more like kind of like conflict driven about it. And there's also this kind of similar, simple, blocky songwriting, but something that I think a lot of the USBM bands do, even more than European bands, is using rhythmic variation to get more blood out of these relatively simple riffs. Just changing the context of how they operate.
That relates to what I was saying. So the physicality of the playing, it's like, da da when that riff comes back up to the root again, it they aren't just playing continuous trem, right? He like changes the riff, but he'll sort of like thrashes out these last few notes of it harder. And it's like it's rhythm functioning as melody there, and it's really expressive, and you hear him forcing it. And also, it's dark. It's hard to write a single string consonant riff that doesn't sound kind of like, at the very least, kind of like the Crazy Train riff, right? We were talking about the last time, like, which was a great riff, right? But you could write, they often sound very sort of upbeat, right? And classically consonant. And here, it has that kind of more high-tension, consonant, noble riffing that I really like, right?
Yeah.
You pointed something out like that really well when we reviewed Carnal Misanthropy. Like, you were like, oh, that's the kind of melodic riff you like.
Very sword-oriented.
Very sword-oriented. Yeah, there's something storming about these riffs, right? You can hear that clearly in the Amon Amarth, and you can hear it here. It's like, here comes my big fucking melodic riff, fucking way. You know?
Which is almost like a uniquely American thing, in a sense. It's just like this big, like, dramatic opening. It's like, wait for this shit, boys. You're gonna love this.
Chest-thumping lumberjack shit, right? That's American black metal. So why don't we go to your... and the other thing it reminds me of, on this sort of just playing consonant single string riffs, but just killing with them, is Axis of Advance.
Oh, yeah.
And so when we say North American or American, when we say like American black metal or US black metal, let's include Canada, right? It's because, especially once you go Finlandic, there's no difference. Right? It's, the cowboy, there were Canadian cowboys, but the cowboy's American thing is like a USA thing. Yeah. This is, right, the Finlandic black metal is indifferent to the USA-Canada distinction.
Yeah.
And so, it is, I mean, Pagan Hellfire's Canadian too. But, just the way that Axis of Advance will play these big, ringing tremolo riffs that have so much force coiled up in them. And they just do it by, like these riffs and like the Amon Amarth riff, just sort of whipping them.
Yeah.
You know? Just fast movement. So what's your next sample?
Well, my next sample is where I'll get into a little bit more of what I think is probably one of the prevailing influences on this record, and one of
your favorite bands.
Yeah, well, probably my favorite U.S. black metal band. And I think it's very essential to the quality of this music and the quality of U.S. black metal in general. So let's listen to this sample off Catacombs of Archaic Doctrines real quick.
There are no uncool song titles on this one.
We should. But yeah, let's give this one a sample, and I'll talk a little bit about what I think about it. So, this sample points to what I think is one of the prevailing influences on this record, and one of the prevailing influences on USBM, and a band that nobody gives a shit about anymore, even though he's amazing, which is Judas Iscariot.
Yes. Who is, you talked about a lot in relation to Black Funeral, and also we reviewed Ancient Gate, which is another one of the best BM releases this year.
Yeah.
Really big Judas Iscariot influence. But so, what's characteristically JI about this?
So, I think... Thank you. I think that the big thing here is that thing you were talking up top, which was this kind of like garage rock or raw punk feel, which has always been a crucial part of, especially later Judas Iscariot, the stuff that really matters. Old Judas Iscariot is very cool, but it's also beholden to a lot of kind of death metal convention. It's not all the way there. But if you listen to something like this, what's interesting is you can hear, it's almost like a Rorschach test. You can hear all these different things in this riff. It could sound like depressive black metal. It could sound like Bill Skirnier. It could sound like Satanic Warmaster. Yeah. But what it really sounds like to me is Judas Iscariot. And I think that that's a matter of these like punky, like down-picked eighth note strumming, which is crucial.
It could be like oi riffing.
Yeah, but with the slowed down drums behind it. And there's also this kind of like morbid turn back to the root chord of this riff. It doesn't end in this cleanly melodic way. It ends in this bleaker sense.
Sort of falls away. And there's that whipped quality, but in slow motion at the end. You could just, a lesser band, an A-minus band, would sit on some of these intervals longer, or have like a smooth rhythmic continuity through it. They do that coming at the end. They change, they syncopate it more.
But the way they end it on that like blended dissonant chord, which is really interesting.
Yes. It's one of the only moments on this album, which could be described as introspective.
This album
is
really
a very outward sort of manly album.
Yeah, this is something that could be straight off of like To Embrace the Corpse's Bleeding, and there's very little shit these days that sounds like that.
Mm-hmm. I think that this part's great, and it also has the feel in it. What you're saying about the sort of the punky thing, and the garage rock thing. Well, so a little bit. You'll hear this more on a set of samples I've picked out. Also a little grungy. That is, grooving, heavy American rock music is highly syncopated, right? Yeah. You stretch out over those mid-tempo things, and you just roll. You're just rolling mid-tempo syncopation. So let's go. That'll segue into this set. So I've picked out just like a series of samples that I think where this band is really getting. So we've talked about various kind of American things about this. And now the question is, what is a distinctly American kind of harmonic language? Yeah. Right? Because a black metal sound has its own harmonic language, has its own little characteristic, as much as it has in common with other black metal riffing or whatever, has its own characteristic chord and melody ideas it can create within this harmonic field. Yeah. And a style of playing, and we've already given you some of that style of playing. But I want to give you an example of this in another band first, that I think often does this really well. This is Elegiac, a band that's sort of been maturing in real time over the last 5 or 6 years. He just releases a ton of stuff. I think his best thing yet is called Vampiric Odinism. Which is
funny. I didn't realize Elegiac was like a thing people cared about, because he did a split with a buddy of mine a while back. So.
Oh yeah, back in the day I think he used to have a more sort of DSBM kind of thing, and he's gone full sort of werewolf America heathen thing. And Vampiric Odinism. You don't usually, there's werewolf music and there's vampire music. You don't have to choose. But here's the opening of here's just the beginning of Blood Religion. Listen to the guitar playing on this.
All right, let's try it out. Well, I mean, it's obviously aping that sort of old West quality, but in a very specific technical way, because he's doing this kind of like, he is playing the electric guitar more like an acoustic guitar, where you're kind of like bouncing in and out of these open strings that would be featured on whole chords. And kind of like, yeah, he's bouncing between power chords and whole chords in this very interesting way that gives a lot of textural variation to this music.
He's playing all these down. He's playing hammer-on riffs, right? That have this kind of organic, this really, this sort of, the plane is very foregrounded over just riff.
Yeah.
And it's, what it really sounds like is hill music. Mm-hmm. It's like Appalachian sort of bluegrass stuff is what it really sounds like. And, you know, you can also hear traces of the blues in there, but it's not, it's more like, it's related to the blues in some sense, sure, but it's really this, it's the pentatonic scale as this distinctly American thing. And it's, look, they're huge pentatonic scale. Yeah, this is the interesting thing. You get the pentatonic scale at the bottom of almost every culture.
Yeah.
The most sort of basic, reptile-brained, in the good sense of the word, sort of primordial folk music. China, Africa, whatever.
Yeah.
And so, you know, you get, on the one hand in America, you get that coming in through like Malian guitar and stuff, coming into black music in America, right? And you get... And that sort of cross-pollinates with hill music, and you get blues and rock and all that.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there's this sort of, there's a black influence on this too, and literally in the form of the banjo, which I believe. But the playing style in hill music is just directly descended. It's like Scots-Irish stuff, right?
Yeah.
It's the American version of Celtic and generally Northern European folk music. Mm-hmm. And it's stripped down to its bare essentials. What are its bare essentials? Pentatonic kind of feel over shifting minor and major chords.
Yeah.
It's, like often, sort of like, you play a traditional Dorian scale noble black metal riff, but you're emphasizing those big, wide pentatonic intervals.
Yeah.
Right? So like the flat, the flat third, or like the big up to the fourth and fifth, and that gives it the garage punk quality too, right?
Yeah.
It's, it's sort of, there's open space even in the riffs. And so here, Mortum does that too, in a slightly more subtle way, but I think it runs throughout this, and we'll try to go through these samples really just basically one after another.
Yeah.
But here's some characteristic things to look for. Pentatonic vibe, hammer-on kind of bluegrass playing, hillbilly playing almost.
Yeah.
And sort of weird kind of swaggering, ballsy grunge quality.
All right.
So first, Macabre Incense is just the beginning of that one.
Let's try that.
And this is, yeah. You are American Thor. You are hurling your 50 caliber lightning down the mountain, roaring, "Get off my lawn."
No, that's pretty great. Well, let's get to the next one.
To me, that's my favorite segment on the album. Next one. Tidal waves dwarf skyscrapers.
All right. Real quick. Also very American.
Yeah, and you've got the pentatonic as the common denominator over this minor to major thing, right?
Yeah.
Almost really like a rock chord change, but it just sounds huge. It gives it this expansive feeling, this opening up feel.
Oh no, I think that might be an essential part of what we want to call true USBM, which is the interpolation of kind of rock melodic ideas into this black metal format.
Yeah, sort of de-rockifying them, but keeping something of it, right?
Yeah.
And it's you can hear the hammer-on quality there, right?
Yeah.
You can hear it drones, it banjos really hard. Okay, last one. This is from the album closing epic, Mount Shasta.
Alrighty. Again, very Judas Iscariot kind of rhythmic variation happening there. Just kind of
you just hear those mountainous pentatonics. Da da da.
Yeah. Like in isolation, it's almost ridiculous, but in the context of the songs, it really works. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's that's another thing about American black metal. It has to be, all black, or a lot of black metal is extremely earnest music, but it has to be like hard on sleeve, sort of naively passionate. It has to be brash and swaggering, and it has to be recklessly indifferent to other people's ideas of taste.
Oh yeah, which this is, like
yes, it's like. Yeah, get ready for my big fucking stomper grunge riff. Here it comes. It's
and to kind of rejoin that with like my theoretical critiques of the record, it would not come off as well with better production or playing. Like the fact that it is the fact that it's a little amateurish is what gives it that power.
Yeah, and I think, probably they probably could play it cleaner if they want. They probably just got drunk and played it.
Yeah, they probably just did they probably just one-tracked everything,
Yeah. It's, and you heard at the beginning of that sample, as the death metal guy said, like the one Slavic moment on this album, right? I kind of there's more of that on this track, and they do it quite well. But if you want another band, and we can sort of basically start wrapping it up now, if you want another band that has a distinctly Slavic take on this same kind of idea of, burly, massive, kind of death metal-y, sort of American mountain man black metal, heathen black metal, Rebizol or Rubizol from Alaska.
I thought you were going to go with my band. Okay.
No. We don't talk about your band.
No. The band I was talking about when we were playing it, which was Plaga.
Oh, yeah, no, I mean, no, but that's not an American band. I was going for an American.
Okay.
Sounding American band. Yeah, you could say something about Plaga in connection to this real quick.
Oh, no, just that the Slavic interpretation of that same idea on Mount Shasta there is really the whole fucking Plaga album.
yeah, Plaga is like, if you hear Migla and you're like, these riffs are cool, but I would like the stomping oi version of it, so that I can, like, jump up, like do pile-ups around the mic with my bros. That's Plaga. And it sucks that they haven't recorded another thing.
Oh, man, I can't believe they haven't done another album. Anyway.
Yeah, they probably would. Somebody's probably in prison, right? It's
I would assume so.
Yeah. But this band from Alaska, Rebezal, it's RU_BEZAHL. I think that's some sort of Germanic or Slavic woods folk figure.
Probably.
It's got this guy's I said this about Death Fortress, right? One of the very few people to actually get inside Roman Sanko's style.
Yeah.
This Rebezal guy, the guitarist, and he makes these just brooding, burly, harmonically complex, sort of Alaskan storm cloud riffs.
Yeah.
And strongly recommend that band. Their EP that came out last year, Tempering of Northern Iron, is
that sounds sick.
Really, it's one of the few things I can just listen to on repeat. And it I highly recommend that as an example of this emerging American sound. And yeah, I think we can start wrapping it up there. I think we had an idea of what we wanted to close out with, right?
Oh, yeah, we did. Well, thanks, everybody, for listening. We'll have some new updates for you next week on some kind of projects we've got in the back. We'll be revealing to you. But let us end this episode on a high note with something we promised a couple segments ago, which is the opening track to the single Megaus album, Open Season, a song called Open Fire. Thanks a lot for listening, guys.
Thanks for listening.
Take it easy.